She could feel the moment start to shift long before anyone else noticed. An uneasy silence settling like dust before a sandstorm. The kind that hinted that something was about to go very, very wrong. If you've ever seen someone underestimated in broad daylight and felt that burning need for justice, make sure to like and subscribe, because what happened next is exactly the kind of story that demands to be heard. This wasn't a tale of conflict born from violence or rage, but from the quiet and corrosive power of assumption. And on that warm California morning, standing outside the administrative entrance of Camp Pendleton, with sunlight glinting off parked government sedans and long ranks of barracks windows, Staff Sergeant Rachel Moreno suddenly found herself at the center of a moment that neither she nor the young Marine in front of her would ever forget. The day had begun peacefully enough. Rachel, 28 years old and recently rotated into a new stateside assignment after years of operational tempo, had been personally invited to the Command Senior Leadership Symposium as a guest speaker. Her reputation as one of the youngest female Marine Corps combat instructors to ever shape advanced infantry curriculum had already preceded her. Instructors, battalion staff, and even senior officers had heard of the woman who led fire teams up ridges in North Carolina in full gear at 0400 without ever losing a Marine to injury or failure. But this morning, she had dressed casually, dark jeans, a plain navy blouse, hair tied back in a tight ponytail. No uniform, no ribbons, no rank insignia. Nothing about her appearance announced her identity, her service, or the catalog of hard-earned lessons written in muscle memory and scars beneath fabric. She arrived early intentionally. She wanted 30 minutes of peace to collect her thoughts, to walk the grounds, breathe in the tired smell of red dirt and jet fuel, and reconnect with the place where so many Marines discovered who they were or who they could become. But before she could cross the training loop toward the symposium building, a sharp voice cut across the morning. "Ma'am, stop right there." The young corporal guarding the gate strode toward her with the clipped confidence of someone who believed rules were iron, and that he, personally, was the hammer. He was tall, lean, fit, perfect grooming standards, boots glinting, sleeves rolled tight like he practiced them in the mirror. He looked at her like she'd somehow trespassed into a sacred space. And even though Rachel had no chip on her shoulder, she also had no intention of shrinking to fit the shape of someone else's assumptions. "Good morning," she said, still smiling. "I'm here for the symposium." The corporal blinked, unimpressed. "This area is for Marines only." She nodded once, patient. "I'm aware." He folded his arms. "Then you'll also be aware that civilians without escort aren't authorized inside." Behind him, two other Marines stopped their casual conversation to watch. They didn't step closer, but their smirks slid into place like loaded rounds clicking into a magazine. Rachel glanced toward the large glass doors of the headquarters annex. Inside, officers in khakis were already moving through reception. She could have simply walked past him and into the building. He technically didn't have the authority to physically stop her, but she believed in letting people choose their actions fully, because lessons taught by consequences tended to last the longest. "I'm not a civilian," she clarified. That should have been the end of it. But the corporal tilted his head, giving her a slow once-over that felt more like a security scan performed with suspicion rather than professionalism. "What's your rank, then?" he asked, his tone casual, but edged with an almost performative challenge. More heads turned. Someone chuckled under their breath. Rachel felt the shift, felt the air snap into the charged stillness of a moment about to escalate. "Staff Sergeant," she replied evenly. But the corporal didn't believe her, not even for a second. She could see it in the twitch of a smirk at the corner of his mouth, the faint raise of one eyebrow, the way disbelief slid across his expression before he even spoke. "Right," he said, "and I'm the sergeant major." His buddies snorted with laughter. For most people, this is where irritation would have sparked. A flare of heat, a rebuttal, and need to prove something. Rachel didn't feel any of that. Instead, her reaction was cooler and much older than anger. She felt the familiar weight of having been judged before the evaluation even began, the reflexive dismissal women, especially women in combat MOS fields, still encountered in the shadows of institutions they helped build. She lifted her access card. "This will verify who I am." The corporal didn't take it immediately. He made her hold it still, letting the moment stretch, then snatched it with unnecessary flair. studying it like a counterfeit bill as civilians and Marines continued entering the building behind him with zero scrutiny. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. "You don't look like a staff sergeant," he finally muttered. "You sure you didn't buy this online?" The laughter returned. 3 Marines entertained at her expense, and a few more in the distance watched as if settling in for a live show. Rachel knew exactly what was happening. This was performative authority, not leadership, not discipline, but ego hunting for validation. "Check your database," she said, voice still mild. "My credentials are active." But the corporal was committed now. He had already stepped onto the wrong path, and each new word was another footprint in concrete. "Ma'am, this is a secure training zone," he announced loudly, now projecting to an invisible audience. "Until I verify your identity, you'll remain here." He wasn't talking to her anymore. He was talking at her. A few Marines shifted uncomfortably, because even among those inclined to mock, there are always some who recognize when a line is being crossed. Rachel didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She simply waited, still and steady as steel cooling. She understood something the corporal did not. Every moment is a chance to reveal yourself, who you are when no one is watching, or in this case, when everyone is. And in that pause, something changed in the air again. A sharp intake of breath sounded 20 feet away. A gunnery sergeant, walking by with a clipboard tucked under his arm, had stopped mid-step. His gaze had locked on something most people had missed, a sterling silver Marine Corps combat instructor ring on Rachel's right hand. Recognition flashed. Shock followed. Because Marines who wore that ring weren't ordinary. They were forged in sweat, respected in whispered stories, and often known by reputation long before they arrived. And that was when the gunny realized the corporal had just stepped into a career-defining mistake. He didn't intervene yet. He simply angled his path toward the small cluster forming in front of the gate. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed perfectly still, not passive, but composed. She had survived worse. White-knuckle fast roping in humidity thick as oil, being the only woman in a platoon of 50 during field leadership evaluations, watching recruits push beyond limits they never knew they had. This was nothing but another training minute. Even if he didn't know it yet, the corporal had already lost. He had misjudged not her identity, but his own professionalism. It was only a matter of time before the consequences arrived. And as the gunny drew closer with purpose, Rachel looked at the young Marine in front of her with a kind of quiet, almost tragic understanding. Because when leaders forget to see the human before the uniform itself begins to fail. The gunny's approach was not dramatic. There was no shouted command, no heavy stomp of boots. But the air changed the moment he closed within 10 feet, like a pressure drop before a coming storm, and even the Marines who had been smirking a moment earlier straightened instinctively. He stopped just behind the young corporal, eyes scanning Rachel again, this time truly looking, not at her jeans, not at her civilian blouse, but at the combat instructor ring glinting on her right hand, the way she carried weight evenly on the balls of her feet, and the quiet, controlled stillness that only came from years of training Marines under conditions that hardened the spine and sharpened the soul. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the corporal took another foolish step deeper into the mistake he still didn't realize he was making. "Ma'am," he said, cutting his eyes toward her with a thin smirk that was beginning to show cracks, "I'm going to need you to come with me. If you refuse, I'll have MPs escort you to the provost marshal's office so we can verify this ID and figure out who you really are." Rachel didn't react, but the gunny's jaw clenched, one muscle feathering under the skin like a pulse under strain. It was clear that he knew exactly how serious the corporal's error was. Not because Rachel had threatened a thing, but because the consequences of disrespecting a Marine combat instructor went far beyond pride or embarrassment. Training commands protected their own, and the institution itself honored them, because those who built Marines shaped the future of the Corps. But the corporal, perhaps too new to fully grasp the weight of tradition, continued with a grand gesture toward a government vehicle parked nearby, already signaling for a lance corporal to retrieve flex cuffs. That was the moment the gunny decided silence was no longer an option. "Corporal," he said quietly. No bark, no command voice, just low and controlled. The corporal turned, and the flicker of tension on the gunny's face should have warned him, but arrogance has a way of making the young deaf and the untested blind. "Yes, gunny." The gunny didn't answer immediately. He simply held the corporal's gaze for one long, uncomfortable beat, then spoke in a voice meant for the corporal alone. "Stand down." It should have ended there. It would have, if the young Marine had recognized the tone, one that came not from emotion, but from experience. But instead, he doubled down. "With respect, gunny, I am enforcing base security." The gunny closed his eyes slowly, the kind of expression a senior enlisted leader makes when he knows the report he'll have to write later is going to require far too much coffee and paperwork. But fate had already decided how the moment would unfold. Because just then, the distant growl of an approaching engine carried across the courtyard, sharp and purposeful. A polished black command SUV turned the corner and rolled toward the entrance, sunlight flashing off the eagle, globe, and anchor license seal on its bumper. Marines who had been standing casually a moment earlier shifted posture, back straightening, hands moving behind them. Not a word was spoken, but the collective acknowledgement was immediate. Someone important was coming. The corporal noticed belatedly. "Gunny, who's that?" The gunny didn't answer. The SUV stopped at the curb with precise alignment, and before its engine had fully settled, multiple doors opened at once. Out stepped the regimental sergeant major, broad shoulders, sleeves crisp, cover perfectly set, and beside him the base commanding officer himself, a full-bird colonel whose decorations told the story of decades in service. The colonel walked with a pace that was neither rushed nor casual, just unavoidable, undeniable inevitability, and the kind of focus that made Marines clear a path without being asked. The corporal's confidence disintegrated visibly, draining from his posture like air from a punctured tire. "Gunny," he whispered, voice suddenly thin. "They're looking this way." The gunny didn't respond. He simply stepped back half a pace, hands clasping behind him, granting the two senior leaders an unobstructed line of sight. They didn't look at the corporal first. They didn't look at the gunny. They looked directly at Rachel. And then, in full view of every Marine within 50 yards, Colonel Harrington, the man who ran that installation, who commanded thousands, snapped his heels together, spine arrow straight, and rendered a salute so sharp it might as well have sliced the wind. It was the kind of salute reserved for generals, for Medal of Honor recipients, for legends whose names carried weight through every battalion of the Corps. "Staff Sergeant Moreno," he said, voice ringing with formality and pride that hit the courtyard like a thundercrack. "Welcome back to Camp Pendleton. The honor is ours." Gasps rippled outward. A few Marines who had been laughing moments ago stood paralyzed, eyes wide, faces draining of color as realization struck like lightning. They hadn't just challenged a staff sergeant. They had tried to detain one of the service's most accomplished young combat instructors. The colonel didn't lower his salute until Rachel returned it, clean, controlled, the kind of movement that revealed training buried deep in muscle memory. When their hands dropped, Colonel Harrington turned, not to Rachel, not to the gunny, but to the corporal who had initiated the confrontation. The courtyard went still, sound falling away until the only thing anyone could hear was the distant whine of a chopper somewhere beyond the base fence. "Corporal," the colonel said, voice quiet, not booming, not dramatic, but the deadly quiet of a man who didn't need volume to command attention. "I understand you detained a Marine combat instructor on her own installation because you didn't believe she looked the part." The corporal swallowed. "Sir, be silent," the colonel said without raising his voice, and the corporal obeyed instantly. Colonel Harrington continued, addressing not just the young Marine, but everyone within earshot. "Staff Sergeant Moreno completed 2 combat deployments before the age of 27. She has trained hundreds of Marines who now serve across the fleet. Her field exercises are still studied by training commands. She did not need to wear her rank today. She earned the right for the institution to recognize her even when she wears nothing but plain clothes and honor." The colonel stepped closer to the corporal, lowering his voice just enough that only those closest heard it clearly. "Your job was not to question her identity. Your job was to verify it with professionalism. The Marine Corps does not teach us to make assumptions. We teach each other to assess, evaluate, then act." A few Marines exchanged looks, some ashamed, some simply humbled. Rachel remained silent, not reveling in the moment, not smirking, not gloating, just steady, like a living lesson in why composure always outlasts ego. Finally, the The colonel turned to the regimental sergeant major. Sergeant major, make a note. This will be a scenario in next week's leadership development session. Names omitted, lesson retained. Aye, sir, the sergeant major responded. The corporal stood rigid, mortified, his earlier arrogance stripped away until only raw understanding remained. Rachel regarded him, not with anger or satisfaction, but with something far more powerful. The steady expectation that he would learn from this, because Marines are meant to grow, not stagnate. The courtyard stayed silent as the senior leaders invited Rachel forward, not to be detained, but to be escorted with respect through the gate that had been denied to her minutes before. And as they walked, the corporal slowly lowered his gaze, not because someone had ordered him to, but because he realized for the first time that authority wasn't something pressed onto a uniform. It was something earned, tested, tempered, and carried inside. The realization weighed heavier than any punishment ever could. Rachel didn't speak until the colonel and sergeant major had stepped ahead, giving her a brief moment alone with the corporal, whose expression had shifted from smug certainty to something far more human. Embarrassment, yes, but also the dawning weight of responsibility. The courtyard had fallen into a quiet stillness, the same kind that comes after a sudden storm, when the air feels strangely clearer and every leaf seems to hang motionless in the pause. The corporal straightened himself, not because anyone demanded it, but because instinct told him the moment called for posture, for composure, for whatever dignity could still be held together. He braced himself for a verbal thrashing, for a scathing lecture, or a remark meant to sting. It never came. Instead, Rachel regarded him with the same calm she had held from the very first second, steadiness that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with who she had become through years of carrying Marines through their first terrifying steps in the Corps. "Corporal," she said quietly, "the uniform doesn't make a Marine. The Marine makes the uniform." The young man swallowed hard, eyes fixed forward as though afraid looking at her directly might make the situation worse. Rachel continued, not cutting, not cruel, but direct in a way that carried more weight than raised voices ever could. "There will be days when you wear that uniform in places where the enemy can't see your rank. Days when you'll need to lead Marines who don't know you. Days when everything will go wrong and your voice will be the only thing holding the line." She paused, letting the silence carry the meaning. "If your confidence comes only from how someone looks, or how you expect them to look, you will fail the Marines who follow you." The corporal exhaled, sharp and unsteady. "Staff Sergeant, I was wrong." The words were not whispered. They were spoken with the kind of raw honesty that only comes when someone has truly felt the weight of their own choices. Rachel nodded once. That's how Marines grow. No more needed to be said. She stepped past him and joined the colonel and sergeant major, who led her through the doors and into the polished corridor beyond. Inside, the mood was entirely different. Officers and senior NCOs already preparing briefing materials, AV equipment humming, the low murmur of military planning filling the space. But the moment Rachel entered, the sergeant major raised his voice, not to announce authority, but to announce respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are joined by Staff Sergeant Rachel Moreno, combat instructor, two-tour veteran, and the Marine responsible for several training evolutions still in fleet use today. She's here to speak on leadership and accountability." Applause rose, not polite or forced, but genuine, an acknowledgement earned long before her boots crossed that threshold. Rachel took her place at the head of the briefing area, and as she set her notes down, she caught a glimpse through the glass entryway. Outside, the corporal was still standing at rigid parade rest, not punished by force, but by the internal reckoning that often shakes Marines more deeply than any corrective action ever could. And in that silent, suspended instant, Rachel understood something she had learned years ago on muddy training grounds while recruits gasped through exhaustion and uncertainty. A Marine's failures are not the moments that define them. How they rise afterward is. She began her presentation with no mention of the confrontation outside. No need to embarrass, no need to drag anyone under the spotlight. Instead, she spoke of responsibility, of perception, of humility, and the strength required to admit a mistake and grow from it. Hours later, when the symposium ended and Marines filtered out of the building discussing leadership principles and lessons learned, Rachel walked back, toward the courtyard. The corporal was still there. He snapped to attention as she approached. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." "Granted. Today changed me," he said, holding nothing back. "I won't make assumptions again. Not about rank, or age, or appearance. Not about anyone." Rachel looked him over, saw sincerity, saw willingness, and most importantly, saw the potential that all Marines possess when given the chance to improve. "That's all anyone can ask," she replied. Then she left him with a final truth, one she had carried through deployments, evaluations, early mornings, and long nights. "Authority is borrowed," she said. "Respect is earned." His chin lifted slightly, as though the words had landed somewhere deep. She offered him a brief nod and walked toward the parking lot, the sun now dipping low across the installation and turning the concrete golden. Behind her, the corporal stood in silence, not thinking of punishment, but of the Marine he intended to become. Because the lesson wasn't about who Rachel was. The lesson was about who he could be. And sometimes, the greatest honors in the Corps do not come from medals or ceremonies. Sometimes, they arrive in plain clothes, with quiet voices, carrying the weight of experience, and teaching the next generation how to lead not with rank, but with character.